you so much for joining us this evening. Great to see those of you who have joined us in person, and we want to welcome those folks who are joining us online from home. If you guys haven't already, we will have you sign in at any point, probably after the talk now, so we can get an accurate head count for our attendance numbers. You can also use that form to sign up for our Lacey newsletter. So my name is Felicia, and I'm the museum coordinator for the Lacey Museum, and our speaker tonight is Dave Nicandri. He will be using a series of rarely seen historic maps drawn from the collection of the Washington State Library and the Washington State Historical Society, and he will discuss the evolution of the Northwest Passage as a cartographic concept. Before we dive in, I would like to begin with a land acknowledgement and some museum news. The Lacey Museum is on the traditional territories of the Coast Salish people, specifically Southern Lushootseed speakers, Nisqually, and Squaxin Island. We acknowledge and remember not to forget those tribal people that are named but not recognized today and absorbed into other tribes for survival or were relocated. We recognize the ancestors and their relations that are still here. Lacey and the South Puget Sound region are encompassed by the Treaty of Medicine Creek, signed under duress in 1854. We respect and affirm tribal sovereignty, and as part of the city of Lacey, we work with Nisqually and Squaxin Island tribes in government-to-government partnerships. Okay, so on to some museum updates. We would love to see you folks down at the museum. We are open Thursdays and Fridays, 11 a.m. to 3 p.m., and then Saturdays, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. We do have the Smithsonian poster exhibit called Journey Stories right now that is up at the museum, and the exhibit explores how movement has shaped our nation with a look at American expansion and migration from the earliest settlers to Native American displacement and to the effects of transportation on modern mobility. Our tours will include some local history as well, so I definitely encourage you folks to come down and check those out. We are also selling Thurston County Historical Journals after the completion of tonight's program. Those will be for sale if you are interested on the back table over there by our curator, Erin. We can take card and cash payment, and these are actually also on sale at the museum as well, and you can stop by during our open hours and we can sell you some Thurston County Historical Journals. Okay. Coming up next month, we hope you will join us again for our May History Talk with Tracy Rebstock. So we are going to be talking about the Lacey Historical Society and their legacy. Tracy will take a look at the Society's history and what it has done over the years and how you can see the Society's presence in Lacey today. Okay, so now on to tonight's presentation. We will hold our Q&A section at the end, as usual. We will do our best to get questions from our in-person and online attendees. So for folks online, if you have questions, you can feel free to submit those during the presentation. There should be a Q&A button on your screen. Usually it's down at the bottom. For those in person, I will be walking around with a microphone so that those watching live and later in the recording, people will be able to hear your questions. Okay, so now I would like to introduce tonight's speaker, historian and author Dave Nicandri. Dave Nicandri is the former director of the Washington State Historical Society, having served in that capacity from 1987 to 2011 when he retired. The Washington State History Museum in downtown Tacoma, now over 25 years old, was his signature achievement. In recent years, Dave has authored several books that inform the topic of his talk. River of Promise, Lewis and Clark on the Columbia, Lewis and Clark Reframed, examining ties to Cook, Vancouver, and Mackenzie, and Captain Cook Rediscovered, Voyaging the Icy Latitudes. Dave has 3 other books in various stages of production, the first being Discovering Nothing, The Evolution of the Northwest Passage, which is projected for publication later this year by UPC Press. The second is Exploring Northwestern Explorers from Fuca to Fremont. And lastly, The Northwest and Other Passages, Tales from the North. Welcome, Dave, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Felicia, and thank you, everyone, for joining us here tonight. I want to extend my appreciation to the Lacey Museum, the City of Lacey, Felicia and Aaron in particular. I'm from the city side, and Darlene Kemery, who has become a trusted aide. She's helped a lot. She's working with a lot of authors these days. The design of the boards and the graphics are Darlene's work, and so Darlene, thanks again for your help. So perhaps the best known fact about our grade school education in American history was the so-called discovery of the New World by Christopher Columbus in 1492. I'm not going to go into that story. We all know the story in general outline. Columbus, other explorers from the European powers in Western and Northern Europe in the 1400s, 1500s were expanding Europe's global reach to the south of Africa, to the East Indies, India itself, China, and of course, on their way to those places, there was an inadvertent discovery of what we now know today as North and South America. I'm not going to go into that story, as I say, in any detail, other than to say that within probably 20 to 30 years, certainly by 50 years after that date, even though the European powers started their process of colonialization, acquisition, imperial domination, and general definement of the cartography of the New World, as it was then called, North and South America. Within a generation or two of those pioneering explorers, the original impulse that drove Columbus west into the Atlantic, which was, of course, as we all know from our grade school history, an attempt to get to the resources and establish a more direct trade route to the East Indies and to China, that process resumed. And so there was simultaneously then the imperial encroachment of the European powers, French, English, Dutch, Swedish, Spanish, Portuguese, all up and down the New World. But again, shortly thereafter, the search for a Northwest Passage, as it came to be called, resumed. It was called a Northwest Passage because if you think of the surface of the globe, whereas Columbus went kind of southeast from Europe, made his inadvertent discovery, and as the huge dimension of the New World was gradually discerned over the course of the 1490s, 1500s, 1510s, and 1520s, it was presumed, because of that terrain that was in those latitudes, that if the search for a shortcut to Asia was to resume, it had to be at a more northerly latitude, above what we would now know today as the Atlantic seaboard, the maritime provinces of Canada, Quebec, et cetera, that if there was a shortcut through or around North America, it was north and west of Europe, thus the name, the Northwest Passage. The first attempts at resurrecting the concept of a shortcut to Asia were all, of course, by definition, directly west of Europe. And so all of the place names that we associate with the Canadian maritime provinces, Canada generally, Baffin Bay, Davis Strait, most famously Hudson Bay, the Hudson River, are all named after explorers who in the 1520s or later resumed the quest that Columbus originated, which was to find the shortcut from Northwest Europe to the East Indies and Asia, the Chinese market in particular, in the 1520s. For 100 years or more, actually closer to 200 years, every attempt at finding a shortcut through or around North America failed. Because, simply put, there was really no Northwest Passage in those latitudes that we later came to discern. Either the continent itself was in the way, or the explorers would find an opening in the continental surface and would hit ice, or they would hit a dead end. Most famously, of course, this occurred with Hudson Bay, which showed great promise initially as being that shortcut through or over the top of North America, but it was in effect a cul-de-sac. Actually, it's not technically. In the 1850s, there was discerned to be an outlet that gets to the actual Northwest Passage that is coming into being today, a concept that I'll return to later. So throughout the 16th century and 17th century, and actually even into the middle of the 18th century, till about the 1740s, every attempt at the Northwest Passage from the Atlantic side failed. But then the Russians began, because of their own continental expansion, eastward moving, empire building, from their Russian homelands across Siberia all the way to the Russian Far East Cape, they began to, word of their work in the Pacific Basin began to reach the European capitals in the 1740s. And that's where our story today, the title of my talk is The Northwest Passage in 5 Maps, begins, because technically the presentation is the evolution of the Pacific portal to the Northwest Passage in 5 maps. That's where it begins. And I'll start first with this map that you see right here. This map was published in 1752. It's of French origination, as you can see by the denomination of the Mer, or the Baie de l'Ouest, the Bay of the West. When the various explorers on the eastern seaboard kept hitting this mass of continent, Hudson, and here's Hudson Bay, as I mentioned earlier, and over here's the Far East Cape of Russia. It was imagined that there was either a network of bays or rivers that would enable one to get through the continent. The Mer, or Bay, the Bay of the West, was imagined as the Pacific analog to Hudson Bay, which is off the Atlantic. This evoked the principle of equipoise and counterpoise, which was a favorite notion of geographers in the 18th century and elsewhere. Namely, if there was a feature on one side of the continent, there was likely a corresponding or mirroring feature on the other side of the continent. In American exploration history, the most famous example of this is Lewis and Clark's expedition regarding the Rocky Mountains, because it was thought, since there was a chain of Appalachian mountains so far in from the coast of a certain height and breadth, that's what the Rocky Mountains, or the western chain of mountains, would look like. And of course, it was an entirely different experience, different talk about Lewis and Clark, but that's an example of the principle of equipoise. Similarly, it was thought that since there was a Hudson Bay, there would be a big bay off the west, and the French called it the Mer, or Baie de l'Ouest. As I said, this map was published in 1752, which is really barely 25 years before Captain Cook would begin to first create some realistic definition of the the Pacific slope of North America. But again, look at the geography here. California is this peninsula. There's this big sea-like incursion into North America, and there's this esoteric system of rivers and channels way up close to the Arctic Circle. And that was the cartographic conception in the 1750s. But the news of the Russian exploration and gradual extension into the Aleutian Islands prompted a great deal of interest in the other European capitals. And that's what eventually launched Captain Cook, who would be the first to look for the Northwest Passage, not from the Atlantic side, where attempts had met nothing but failure for a couple hundred years, to a new range for maneuver, perhaps on the Pacific side of the continent. So that's an image. That is the projection of the western half of our quadrant of the continent, a mere 25 years before Captain Cook. This map was actually the last map published before Cook sailed. Cook left his port of debarkation on July 14th, 1776. Kind of an interesting month in time, as we would all know from another aspect of American history. In fact, in the slips right next to where Cook's 2 ships were were the Hessians boarding the British transports to come over here to help suppress, so they thought, the American Revolution. This projection is perhaps even a movement backwards in geographic comprehension, even though it's more recent or more modern. For example, you would recognize here the Kamchatka Peninsula. There was a big volcanic explosion there a couple of days ago, apparently. Dust like we saw with Mount St. Helens. Here's the North American continent, and between the far east cape of Asia here and North America here is the island of Alaska. So this earlier map has California almost an island, and here we have Alaska as an island between the two continents. In fact, prior to the 1740s and 50s, when Vitus Bering, on behalf of Russia, began to sail into the North Pacific, it wasn't entirely a sure thing that North America and Asia were connected at about where Bering Strait is, but in fact there is a gap, as we all know. Now this map would confound Captain Cook to a great extent, because it's obviously a garbled interpretation of what we would all conceive and know of as the Aleutian chain. That chain of islands that extend out from the Alaska Peninsula well across the North Pacific. In this case, even tucked under the far eastern cape of Russia. Historians have debated whether this map was purposefully fudged, the geographic information, in order to deceive other people, because geographic information was greatly prized by all of the powers in Europe. Cook would sail here in 1778, looking for the Northwest Passage. So 1752, 1775, the year before Captain Cook sails. Now let me introduce Captain Cook more fully, because he's really kind of, in many respects, the central figure in this story. He had 3 great voyages to the Pacific Basin. Starting in the late 1760s, he had actually come up, he had migrated to the Royal Navy, having started in the coal trade. You've all heard the expression, don't carry coal to Newcastle. Of course, the British coal trade took coal from Newcastle to London. That's how Cook started his naval career. He transferred over to the Royal Navy just at the time the 7 Years' War was commencing. We know it in North America as the French and Indian War. And Captain Cook actually played a significant role in the French and Indian War, so-called, because the great French bastion, the key to French control of Quebec, all of that terrain north of the United States proper today, was guarded from the great citadel at Quebec City, north and east of Montreal. They had a tremendous big fort that guarded the St. Lawrence River, which was the gateway to North America in those latitudes. And the French were confident that the British would never be able to get by this post, and therefore they could fend off, the maritime provinces, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland. That might be vulnerable, but the British can never conquer Quebec, because they can never conquer the citadel at what we know today as Quebec City. But the British outsmarted them, more particularly Captain Cook outsmarted him. Wasn't his idea, but he effected a resurveying of the St. Lawrence River. What I mean by that is the French figured if they pulled up all the channel markers that showed where the rocks and the shoals were in the St. Lawrence River, that no navy could ever get by the citadel, could never get by the fortress at Quebec City. But Cook led the effort by dropping a lead line down into the water and figuring out the depths, figuring out where the shoals and the rocks were. He remarked the whole basin below the city of Quebec City that allowed the English Navy to get by the fort. And actually, Quebec fell from an attack from west to east, rather than, as the French expected, directly on, going from east to west. So that was Cook's initial claim to fame in the Battle of Quebec, 1760. He surveyed Newfoundland. another very complex coastline over the course of 6 years after the war was over. He mapped that and was given an assignment in the late 1760s to lead an expedition to Tahiti, it turned out, where he was to deliver an astronomer who would record or observe the transit of Venus. This is another very esoteric aspect of the history of astronomy, but in concept, the notion was that if you, it took a whole generation of astronomers and physicists and mathematicians to figure this out, but if you could time from various points on the Earth's surface, then the amount of time of when the little dot of Venus would cross over the face of the sun's surface, you could actually calculate how far Venus was from Earth. You could calculate the distance from the Earth to the sun. We all know that that's approximately 93 million miles. Well, how do we know that, since no one at that time was able to travel 93 million miles? You did it through a very complex mathematical formula for which the transit of Venus was the key. So Cook was sent there. There were astronomers in India and Siberia, the North Cape of Norway. Thomas Jefferson had an observatory the day the Venus passed across the face of the sun. The King of England, King George III, had a little observatory set up on his palace grounds. This was the great astronomical event of the 18th century. Cook was given the assignment to deliver an astronomer to Tahiti in the Central Pacific because, again, if you could calculate this transit, and just maybe to give a better definition to what a transit is, when the moon gets between Earth and the sun, we call that a lunar eclipse. It's also a transit. Another astronomical object passes between a point of observation on Earth and the sun's surface. In the case of a lunar eclipse, it's total. When it's a planet, it's a little dot that moves across the surface of the sun. If you were on Mars, episodically, you'd see Earth pass across the face of the sun. And I'm sure some astronomer somewhere has calculated when the transit of Earth is visible from Mars or Jupiter or wherever they might be. So that was Cook's first voyage. His second voyage, which commenced in 1771, was to try to assess the reality of whether there was a continent in the southern hemisphere that matched the land masses in the northern hemisphere. Specifically, was there a continent in the southern hemisphere generally of the same mass and dimension and latitudinal placement in the southern hemisphere that Eurasia was in the northern hemisphere? Now, we know there is no such place. The term of art was Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land, from which the continent of Australia derives its name. Except the continent wasn't the size of Australia as we know it. It was the size of Europe and Asia combined, somewhere in the 40s, 50s of southern latitude. And it was thought that this had to exist because, again, I introduced the principle of equipoise earlier. Here was the principle of counterpoise. It was presumed, since there was this big landmass and the series of land masses, North America, Eurasia, in the northern hemisphere, there had to be a corresponding landmass in the southern hemisphere. Otherwise, the Earth would wobble on its axis. Kind of a naive interpretation, we'd all agree, but that was the premise. It just simply required an explorer to travel to the southern hemisphere to find it. A big terrain of land in addition to southern Africa, in addition to South America. Now, of course, we know that such a landmass does not exist. Cook, over the course of 3 years, crisscrossed the southern Indian, Pacific, and Atlantic Ocean in that order, basically vacating the southern hemisphere of any potential for a southern continent, which, like the Northwest Passage, was one of the two great geographic mysteries of the age. And Cook might very well have retired at that point. It was a celebrated voyage, epic in many respects, but he was talked out of retirement, somewhat infamously, and conducted his third voyage of exploration, commenced it in July of 1776, again, as I said, the very same month that the Hessians were dispatched to North America to put down the rebellion. It was thought, of course, they did not. Cook's third voyage, therefore, was to gets us back to the Northwest Passage. So he's developed this reputation as the greatest explorer of his time, or maybe of all time. And since several centuries worth of explorers hadn't found the Northwest Passage from the Atlantic side, the thought that occurred to the British Admiralty was, let's send someone to the Pacific slope of North America in the North Pacific to see if we can't find the Northwest Passage through the back door, so to speak, since the front door always seemed to be blocked. In short, that was Cook's mission, to try to find the Northwest Passage from the Pacific side of the continent. And in brief, he was unsuccessful for the very same reason all the explorers, including Hudson, Davis, Baffin, were unsuccessful in the 1500s. He hit ice over above what we now know today as Alaska. Not the island of Alaska that was pictured here in this map of 1775, but the Alaska of subcontinental dimensions that you see here in this third map, which was the first map to actually generally, with reasonable degree of accuracy, depict the northwesterly trend line of the Pacific slope of North America and the full subcontinental dimension of Alaska that you can see here, including the Alaska Peninsula and an intimation of the actual Aleutian Islands directly south of Bering Strait, not this fanciful amalgamation of islands that are almost all the way to Kamchatka. In my book, Captain Cook Rediscovered and Elsewhere, I have described this map, and this is an inset of a larger map that Darlene designed for me. This just shows the Pacific Basin, the projection, and this map appeared in the Atlas to Cook's third voyage, published in 1784. The actual voyage ran from 1776 to 1780. Now, as you all know, Cook died during the course of this voyage. He was killed in Hawaii on February 14th, 1779. The original St. Valentine's Day massacre. That was supposed to be a joke. John got it. Cook didn't live to see the end of that voyage, but his crew, largely, a few other people, in fact, his direct successor, Charles Clark, second in command, also died on that expedition. He was actually buried in Kamchatka after Cook's failed attempt. So this map, I've likened it to actually being the first modern map of the world. If you look at the entire projection, it kind of looks like the Pacific Basin looks like. I mean, here's Baja, California. There's the northwest coast, Alaska. You've got that span. You've got the Hawaiian Islands out here, which, of course, Cook inadvertently discovered on his way north because he sailed to the Pacific Ocean, through the Indian Ocean, south of Australia, stopped at New Zealand. Tahiti, was on his way north to North America when he stumbled into the Hawaiian Islands, which he named the Sandwich Islands after Lord Sandwich, who was the first Lord of the Admiralty. So Cook is out in our waters out here off the Pacific Ocean in April 1778. By May, he's in Prince William Sound, which he named. You know, there was all these weird place names in Alaska that have these odd British intonations. Prince William Sound. Cape Prince of Wales, which is the westernmost part of North America, which is the furthest western cape of Alaska that you see here. And it was Cook, therefore, who delineated the coastline, established the subcontinental dimensions of Alaska, established with certitude that there was a gap between the far east cape of Asia and the far western cape of North America, and was attempting to cross atop North America in August of 1778 when he hit the Arctic ice pack and could no longer proceed east. He was such an indefatigable explorer, he got the idea, which his instructions allowed him to, which was that if you couldn't find the passage going east across the top of North America, you have the latitude to go west over Eurasia and try to reach the North Sea. And he tried both. He tried going east above North America first, hit the ice, tried to go west, hit the ice again, came south to overwinter in Hawaii. That's when he was killed. His crew tried a second time, failed again for the same reason, because the ice pack was impenetrable. Now, just as a sidebar, but actually it's a key concept I'll come back to later. If Cook or someone like him were to try to attempt that navigation at that time, at the same time of year, today, he'd probably get through, because the ice has just diminished in such volumes that and seasonally it is done to this day. There are a lot of voyages that travel through the Northwest, through the northern Canadian archipelago today. There are a lot more voyages that travel over what's called the Northern Sea Route across Siberia and Russia. And so today, the Northwest Passage is coming into existence if it's, as a navigable route, which is a concept I'll return to in due course. So you have these early sketches. Cook provides real definition for the first time, but a Northwest Passage still was not found for the same reason it hadn't been found for the preceding 200 years. But here's where the evolution of the Northwest Passage begins, because this was such a desirable idea. It's what impelled Columbus, in a sense, westward. Frobisher, Baffin, Davis, Hudson, all of those guys came to naught. Let's try from the Pacific side. Cook, the great Cook, can't find a Northwest Passage, but this was such a fixed idea in the minds of commercial entrepreneurs, imperial theorists, that the concept of the Northwest Passage went through an evolution. And that's where we're going to take the story with these, with the remaining maps we have here. But I want to start that by actually going back to this map, because when Cook sailed along here in 1778, he found kind of a fixed line. The maritime fur traders who came in his wake, because one of the consequences of Cook's third voyage was another inadvertent discovery, sort of like the discovery of what we know as the Hawaiian Islands. They discovered that a fur acquired at Nootka Sound on what's now the west coast of Vancouver Island. They discovered, this is after Cook died, on their way back home in China, they discovered that a sea otter pelt acquired at Nootka Sound on the way north in 1778, acquired for a nail, could be sold in China for 100 Spanish dollars. In fact, the commander of the expedition at that point, of course, Cook's dead, Captain Clark's dead, now it's John Gore, the third commander. He almost had to suppress a mutiny because the discovery by the men on Cook's third expedition, if we go back to North America, we can become rich. He had to fend that off. He got everyone back to England in 1780, but news of this commercial discovery, the value of the maritime fur trade, set off a kind of a gold, historians have called it the soft gold rush, soft gold being beaver fur, sea otter fur more specifically. So the maritime fur traders started frequenting this coast, our northwest coast, beginning in the mid-1780s. The best known of them to you is probably Robert Gray, who's known to those of us in the Northwest because it was his ship, the Columbia Rediviva, that was the first to cross over the bar of the Columbia River, which is named after his ship, again, Columbia Rediviva. But Gray was among several dozen fur traders. But because the fur traders were lingering in the waters of the Northwest, a more leisurely manner than Cook had available, but Cook's direction said, get to 65 degrees north and look for the Northwest Passage. So he didn't spend a lot of time defining the Northwest coast because it wasn't really his mission. Everyone knew there would be no, by Cook's time, there would be no, or presumed that there would be no Northwest Passage because someone would have seen it. But the fur traders, turning now to this map, When they come to the Northwest coast in the 1780s, they begin to see, these maps have a slightly different orientation. So here's the Alaska subcontinent, the Alaska Peninsula, the Aleutians out here. Cook Inlet, named of course after Cook, or modern city of Anchorage, Prince William Sound. But I call your attention in particular to the coastline of the Alaska, what we know as the Alaska Panhandle, Queen Charlotte Islands, now known as Haida Gwaii, down towards the first intimation way down here of what we know as the Strait of Juan de Fuca. In short, the maritime fur traders coming to the waters that Cook had visited and publicized in a fashion, really the men who succeeded and publicized, the fur traders found a far more complicated coastline than Cook's survey of 1778 indicated, because this almost looks like a straight edge. Historians have often criticized Cook for not finding the Columbia River, for not finding the Strait of Juan de Fuca. But again, I just remind everyone, Cook's mission was not in our latitudes. He was directed to go to 65 degrees north and look for the Northwest Passage. Of course, he doesn't find it. The fur traders find a far more complicated coastline with lots of bays, inlets, channels, and because the Northwest Passage was such a fixed idea, it just had such a grip on the mercantile mindset, that geographers of the speculative and not so speculative variety began resurrecting ideas that there was a big inland sea over here, because again, Cook's coastline was more complicated than he had indicated. And so maybe this big inlet or other concourses or transits through North America existed. This map is actually, and this is probably getting way too deep into the material culture of this, but this is, it's titled Northwest Coast of North America Explored in the years 1778 and 1779. That's Cook's map. And you can see Cook's track. It's the same in greater detail here. You can see the track. This is just a bigger format. So what this cartographer did in 1790 is he took the copper imprint on which Cook's map of the North Pacific was engraved. He brushed off he pounded the copper flat, and then reinscribed this coastline with this level of detail remaining the same. So the underlying cartography is Cook, but this was adjusted to reflect all of the discoveries of Gray and Kendrick, the British, and all the other fur traders who visited these waters in the 1780s. This map was the last map published before George Vancouver was sent to the Northwest coast, beginning with his exploration in 1792. And that's where we'll turn next. Vancouver, who had sailed with Cook on both the second and third voyage to the southern hemisphere, third voyage looking for the Northwest Passage, was given commission for his voyage, which was mostly a diplomatic mission. Vancouver was sent to these our waters here, mostly to settle, implement provisions of a treaty between Great Britain and Spain regarding a tempest that British fur traders and Spanish government officials got into on Vancouver, up on the Northwest coast, what's now Nootka Sound on Vancouver Island. But he was given the collateral mission to try to settle once and for all. Is there a Northwest Passage? Is it conceivable that a great bay or inland sea like this exists on the North American continent? So he hit the Pacific slope of North America down on what we now know today as the California coast. And basically his job was to keep the North American continent to his right, always probing every conceivable inlet to see if any of them would lead deep into North America. And the joke I like to tell is that George Vancouver sailed into the Strait of Juan de Fuca, which you can see the earliest intimation of. That's the very original cartographic projection of what the Strait of Juan de Fuca existed, because Vancouver Island wasn't known to exist separately as an insular proposition. Cook thought Vancouver Island was a part of the continental mainland. So Vancouver sails into the Strait of Juan de Fuca, goes down Hood Inlet, which he named, went through, comes back out because Hood Canal rather, is a dead end, backs out, comes through Admiralty Inlet, the water between Port Townsend and Whidbey Island. Whidbey is one of his sailing masters. Sails through Admiralty Inlet, comes down to Puget Sound, one of Vancouver's principal lieutenants. And my joke is that Vancouver sails into the Strait of Juan de Fuca, hoping to get close to Hudson Bay, when in fact all he does is get close to Tumwater, or Olympia at least. It'll be Tumwater again as soon as the estuary is reestablished, which personally I hope happens. So, and Vancouver, of course, does much more, which you can see delineated here on this last map, our fifth map, which was actually published in conjunction with another explorer who I'll introduce here shortly, Alexander Mackenzie. But I introduced this map because now, finally, we see the intricate detail in what we would recognize today as being faithful to actual geographic reality. Here's the Strait of Juan de Fuca. There's Puget Sound. Vancouver Island is actually an island. Actually, Vancouver wanted to name it Vancouver and Quadra Island. Quadra was his counterpart from Spain with whom he was going to negotiate the diplomatic arrangement. That fell out of usage. It's now known, of course, just as Vancouver Island. The Queen Charlotte Islands, again, Haida Gwaii, and all of the inlets all the way back up to Alaska. Vancouver proved indisputably there was no mid-latitude, and by that I mean in the 40s or 50s or 60s, but Cook proved there was no passage at 60 or north. Vancouver proved indisputably there was no Northwest Passage in the 40s and 50s, once and for all. That was the second version of a Northwest Passage. In other words, Vancouver was sent out to sea, or determine, if this concept existed, because if there wasn't a navigable route directly from the Atlantic waters, Hudson Bay or otherwise, to the Pacific, maybe you could just narrow the gap. So there was just a little land bridge one had to traverse in order to accomplish the net commercial effect of a Northwest Passage. Cook relegated this once and for all to the dustbin of history. No such inland, there's an extensive inland water, which we know is the Salish Sea. Again, Puget Sound, Strait of Juan de Fuca, Georgia Strait, but it's nothing of this magnitude. And by the way, just a footnote, Puget Sound, by that term, Vancouver actually meant the fingers of water down south of the Tacoma Narrows, because a sound is basically a multi-fingered bay or inlet. That's what the term means technically. Puget Sound, as a geographic notion, has gravitated to all of the inland waters from Tumwater to Blaine. That wasn't George Vancouver's conception. He considered the larger body of water that now forms the inland waters of western Washington. He thought that should be called Admiralty Inlet, which has now been narrowed down to just the channel between Port Townsend and Whidbey Island. That's what people call Admiralty Inlet. He considered the whole body to be Admiralty Inlet, of which one subset was Puget Sound. But I digress. The main point was that the Northwest Passage still remained an ideal. It still remained a concept that's worth pursuing. And so since a direct ocean-to-ocean saltwater passage didn't exist, Cook kind of proved that. And since a continental land bridge concept, as seen here, Vancouver proved that didn't exist, A third version of the Northwest Passage was invented, which was a network of lakes and rivers that would take one from St. Lawrence River, again, Montreal, Quebec, through the Great Lakes, across the rivers and lakes of Canada, to the west coast of North America. The key figure in that regard is Alexander Mackenzie. This is the map from his account, which was published in 1801. Cook, 1778, nothing. Vancouver, 1792, published in 1798, nothing. Mackenzie's actually going overland the same year that Vancouver is on the inside of Vancouver Island. They missed each other by a few weeks. Mackenzie's trying to create a network that'll move trade across North America through this system of lakes and rivers. In 1789, he makes it all the way to the Arctic Ocean on a river that bears his name, the Mackenzie River. That obviously won't do. He's looking for a river that goes west. That river took him north. So he tries 4 years later, and in 1793, makes it to about where modern Bella Coola is on the central British Columbia coast. He publishes his account of travels in 1801, which includes this map, in which he incorporated Vancouver's cartography, you see. So Vancouver published this in 1798. Mackenzie's map is published in 1801. And it is this map, once Thomas Jefferson sees it, that launches what we know as the Lewis and Clark expedition. Because in the concluding few paragraphs of Mackenzie's account, called Voyages from Montreal, and it's hundreds of pages long, but the last 3 or 4 pages are kind of a business plan, and in which basically he says, if the British build out a trading infrastructure through this lake and river system, the Saskatchewan, Winnipeg Lake, the Peace River, it will be possible to create a fur trading network that the British can dominate and actually get to the West Coast to prevent the Americans from competing in the fur trade with us. And it's that strategic threat that prompts Thomas Jefferson to think, I got to get my guys out in the West so that we can create a competitive cartographic, geographic scheme. But maybe ideally one that's even farther south than this northern one that the British think they can work, the Mackenzie hypothesizes in 1801. And actually Lewis and Clark are given a map that's based upon this chart that fills in, see how this is all kind of, again, terra incognita, nothing there. And so the map that the War Department that Jefferson commissions that's given to Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, it fills in this land down here with a hypothetical river system, which we would all know today notionally as the Snake River system, but it was just pure hypothetical speculation, not entirely unjustified. Again, because of the principle of equipoise, counterpoise. If there's water flowing to the Atlantic from the middle of the continent, there's got to be a river system of some kind flowing to the west here. Of course, we know that in general terms as the Columbia River. And although Mackenzie kind of mapped out a route, it wasn't as did Lewis and Clark in 1804, 5, and 6. When Meriwether Lewis got back to St. Louis in September of 1806, the first thing he did was write a letter to Thomas Jefferson and says, I have found the most practicable route for trade across North America. Of course, no one likes to disappoint the president then or now. It was pure fantasy. There was no, you could hack your way through with if you had enough frontier, wilderness skills, as Lewis and Clark did. But there was no viable transcontinental opening to the Asian markets. It just was not workable. So therefore, just to kind of sum it up, the third version of the Northwest Passage also failed to evolve or to exist. Saltwater to saltwater, Cook doesn't exist. Land bridge shortcut, George Vancouver, doesn't exist. Network of lakes and rivers, that didn't exist. But still the idea has such a grip on the imagination that by the 1840s, with the evolution of technology, specifically steam engine applied to rails, that is to say railroads, people get the idea. If we can't find a Northwest Passage in nature, let's build one. And that's basically what the transcontinental railroads become. And this story relates directly to our state in our early history, because the first person to look for a railroad route in the northern latitudes of the United States is our first territorial governor, Isaac Stevens. We think of Stevens for a whole host of reasons, including the treaties that he foisted off on the native people, as properly acknowledged at the outset of the program, but he was also an explorer of significant rank. And he didn't really discover anything other than he laid out a corridor over which a transcontinental railroad might be built. And in the 1880s, Civil War intervened. We know all about that complication. A Northern Pacific Railroad, generally on the corridor that Isaac Stevens identified in 1853 when he first came here as territorial governor, was built. And so in that sense, the Northwest Passage was finally achieved. And if you ever go up to Tacoma, you go down to Kalama, and you watch those 1.5 mile long trains roll by with all those container cargoes, that, ladies and gentlemen, is the Northwest Passage in action. That's trade and commerce working from Asia to North America, across North America to Europe, and back the other way. Every day. It goes right through that portion of Lacey out there, I think, if I've got my directions correctly. You see it by the Amtrak station. That is the Northwest Passage in action. Just took a while. As I said, one wasn't discovered, but one was built. So I'll just wrap up, and I've gone longer than I intended. You've been a great audience. I appreciate your attention, time and attention. But to go back to Cook, as I said earlier, in 1778, he hit ice, not quite as far as Barrow, Icy Cape, which he named because he hit the ice, by Kotzebue Sound, those of you who are familiar with that part of Alaska. And as I said, as I intimated earlier, if Cook or someone like him were to sail up there this summer, August, September 2023, one could get through the Northwest Passage, and one was eventually navigated. And the famous, we associate him with Antarctica, Roald Amundsen in 1906 actually did transect the Northwest Passage in the classic sense. Level water, Atlantic to Pacific, with 2 winters over stuck in the ice, then it finally came out in 1906. But today, if one were to sail those waters seasonally, one could get through. And there's where I will end, because unless something dramatic happens with the rate of global warming, climate change, the rapid loss of ice, I mean, there's glaciers and pack ice is disappearing at both the poles, but in the Arctic more particularly because of the configuration of the continents. It just kind of accentuates the power of global warming. And with the passage of time, it's entirely conceivable that the Arctic Ocean will be open all year long, and that it would become, in a fashion, if you just bear with me with this analogy, the Arctic Ocean could actually become kind of a new Mediterranean. I mean, there are great consequences associated with this. I'm not suggesting it's an unadulterated good, but it's conceivable within, not our lifetime, but within 100 years, again, if the pace of warming continues, that ice would be a kind of a seasonal thing, only in the very depths of winter. And then much of the year, you'd be able to sail through the Arctic like you would across the Mediterranean that we know today in southern Europe. So that is the story, therefore, of the Northwest Passage. Through 5 maps with a few other allusions, I hope I haven't jumped around too much. Again, I appreciate your time and attention. If there are any questions, I'd be glad to answer them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dave. We are going to move on to our Q&A section of our program today. So just a reminder for folks who are watching online, the Q&A button is at the bottom of your screen. And then I will be walking around with the microphone for anyone who has questions in person. Go ahead and raise your hand and I will make my way to you.
While we're waiting for a question, there is a comment. Great lecture. Dave is an interesting and very knowledgeable speaker. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
I probably don't need that.
I can't hear you online.
Oh, they can hear me online?
yeah.
Okay. All right. I'm wondering about David Thompson and his relationship to Mackenzie and whether or not he was also a part of that effort to find that passage or if he was just more focused on the fur trade.
Yeah, Thompson's, there are different kinds of exploration, different kinds of explorers. Thompson's was a naturalist and fur trader as well. He played a significant role in the definition of the alignment of the Columbia River. But he wasn't really an accomplished and a significant explorer, but the Northwest Passage wasn't really part of his thing. It wasn't his milieu. It was important work defining the Columbia River route, and it was an important trade route. I didn't mean to suggest, and I might have given this impression when I said that the Northwest Passage didn't exist. The Northwest Passage wasn't realized in the sense that the ancient idea of a direct shortcut from Europe to Asia wasn't as envisioned. But the Columbia River, because of the work of Thompson and others, did serve as the conduit for trade between the Hudson Bay Company and headquartered on Hudson Bay. Actually, the headquarters was in Britain. It was a royally chartered company. The second most important fort in the Hudson Bay Company empire in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s was Fort Vancouver here in our own state of Washington. It was second only to the posts on the western side of Hudson Bay. My point being, the Columbia River was one of the means by which the furs and the trade goods for the native people was able to transport across the continent. So a trade route, because of Thompson's work and others, was created. It just wasn't the classic big notion of a Northwest Passage, again, that Columbus was looking for, that Cook was looking for, that Vancouver was looking for. The more limited concept, an important explorer, but not really central to the Northwest Passage story. Good question. I'm glad you brought him up.
We have another question online. This person wants to know if Gray's Harbor was named for the person named Gray that you mentioned earlier.
Yes, Gray's Harbor. Let me see if it shows up on this. No, it doesn't go. This map doesn't go far enough south. By the way, this map has never been published before. This is the map I discovered at the Washington State Library. It's incredibly rare because, as I said, and it's a very intricate material culture thing I got into, but the engraver took the original engraving of Cook's chart of the North Pacific, pounded the copper flat so he could reinscribe it with his new coastline. That map will be in my next book, Discovering Nothing, that Felicia mentioned at the outset. So anyway, I was hoping Gray's Harbor would be on here, but the map is cut off there. But yes, Gray's Harbor, just west of us, is named after the same Robert Gray who named the Columbia River after his ship, Columbia Rediviva, one and the same. Fur trader, 1788, 1792.
What instruments did they use to make the maps like that?
Well, are we talking about recording the information or
Dave,
making the
can
map?
you restate the question?
The information.
The question was, what instruments were used to make the map? And my clarifying question of the question, to make the engraving or to come up with the data that went on the engraving?
Come up with the data
The data, okay. Well,
and to plot it on the map.
well, this is relatively simple. Again, one would extrapolate from the running surveys the explorers would take. It was relatively easy to calculate one's latitude. All you have to do is measure the angle of the sun above the horizon, and that'll tell you whether you're 40 degrees north, 45, 50, or 89 or 90. Longitude is a much harder thing to calculate. Cook, again, that was another one of Cook's breakthroughs, because Cook had with him a chronometer, a timepiece. Again, it's another very intricate concept that I'm barely able to understand myself, let alone explain to other people. But if you have a clock that tells you what the time is in Greenwich, England, you can tell, and then you can establish when noon is wherever you might be in the Indian, Atlantic, or Pacific Ocean. You can tell what your longitude is just by measuring westward from Greenwich. So latitude and longitude are the key concepts. And then these voyages, I mean, Vancouver, to create this chart, and actually Vancouver's charts are far more detailed than this. I only included this because it allows me to talk about Vancouver and Mackenzie. Vancouver's charts are actually far more intricate than this. But if you have 3 summers, the summers of 1792, 93, and 94, and all you're doing is going through every bay and inlet and opening and channel between Tumwater and Cook Inlet, and you find no opening into the continent, and you calculate on a daily basis what your latitude and longitude is, an engraver can translate that by chiseling in the copper. I mean, that's where the term comes from. The copper is engraved in reverse. In other words, this image, including the typography, had to be carved into the copper plate in reverse so that when you take a print of it, it shows the positive image. And that was a lot of trial and error associated with the process like that. But an engraving like this would take someone months to chisel into the copper. You'd run a proof. Oh, I made a mistake. You'd brush it out and you'd re-engrave it, sort of like a jeweler. So it's a very intricate science. And so I hope that's somewhat faithful to as an answer to your question.
We have another online question. This person wants to know, did Vancouver go all the way to the farthest southern fingers of Puget Sound, such as Mud Bay, Bud Bay, and Eld Inlet?
Vancouver did not come into Bud Bay. Bud Bay, by the way, and Eld Inlet were named by Charles Wilkes, who was an American explorer who came into these waters in the 1840s, just to clarify that. So not all of the waters in Puget Sound were named by Vancouver. Wilkes was the other. Vancouver and Wilkes were the great namers, if you will, 50 years apart. Vancouver would basically position his ship at a central location in a larger body of water, and he'd send out crews in the smaller shore boats, north, south, east, west, and that's where the actual detailed geographic work that I was responding to your question was done. Occasionally, Vancouver would get into boats himself, not the big ship. He would kind of park that in a single spot. But Vancouver actually did row or sail across the opening, the northern opening into Bud Inlet on his way into Eld Inlet, but by my reading of his journal, did not actually enter into Bud Inlet. And I hope that answers that person's question. He came close. As I say, he was looking for Hudson Bay and ended up in Tumwater. That's not quite true, but he did end up at Mud Bay, but only Ralph Monroe lives at Mud Bay. There are more people that live at Tumwater.
Okay.
John.
This may be a little bit off point, but the legislature and all of us in this room, and when you were a Tumwater City Council person, we all use Robert's Rules of Order. Was he involved in any of this?
Boy, I don't...
Lieutenant Roberts, that's what it's from. He was a British sailor.
Is he the one that originated Robert's Rules?
Yes, sir.
Henry Roberts?
I couldn't remember which group he was with. Yeah.
Are Robert's Rules... no, truly, John, Robert's Rules, they were devised by because Henry Roberts was the engraver of this map. I don't know if it's Robert's Rules of Order. But yeah, Henry Roberts.
Robert's Rules of Order came from the English sea, admiralty, somewhere.
That's a smack your head moment. I never knew that. That's why you do talks like that. I never knew that, John.
I may not know it either. But I read it somewhere.
Maybe somebody can Google that while we're here chatting so amiably. Any other questions?
It says, Robert's Rules of Manual of Parliamentary Procedure by U.S. Army Officer Henry Martin.
Ah, different guy.
Could
When?
Who's a good fit? That's such a good question. 1876, actually.
Oh, no, much later. Yeah. It was a great notion, John. Sometimes a great notion, somebody once read.
How long did Mackenzie's expedition take?
Well, let me go back over that because I was getting conscious of the time. So Mackenzie's book is Voyages from Montreal. He was a Scotsman, obviously. He started out, he was with the Northwest Company, which was the kind of, I'm not sure anyone even knows the term. Anyone ever heard the term Jippo logger? So, the olders of you. So Jippo logger was kind of a bootstrapper, kind of set up as opposed to a big company like Crown Zellerback or Weyerhaeuser. So there's the Jippo loggers, and then there's so the Northwest Company were like a series of Jippo fur traders. They didn't have the charter the Hudson Bay Company had, but they wanted to engage in the fur trade. They're called the Northwest Company, kind of a loose amalgamation, headquartered in Vancouver, in Montreal. And a fellow by the name of Peter Pond kind of sketched out a lot of these lakes and rivers out here in the 1780s. He handed the mantle over to to Mackenzie. It was Mackenzie who kind of took that vision and extended it to the edge of the continent, again, to the Arctic Ocean in 1789. In fact, he reached the Arctic Ocean on July 14th, 1789. That's the day the Bastille fell in Paris. But he hit ice up here. I mean, the delta was open. He got there again in the midsummer. But he could see ice off in the distance. He knew that wasn't the desired destination. So he goes back to Lake Athabasca, which is kind of his inland headquarters, northwest of modern Edmonton. Actually goes to England to learn how to be a better astronomer so he can calculate his latitude and longitude. And then in 1793, he crosses over the Continental Divide, goes up the Peace River, and is beginning to descend what we all know as the Fraser River when he's told by some natives, you do not want to go down the Fraser River. There's a horrendous canyon. You'll never survive it. We know it as Hell Gate. It's there by Lytton and not Cache Creek, but there's some other towns. And so he takes their advice. He's a smart man. These people live here. They know what's possible. So instead of going all the way down the Fraser River, which would take him out by where modern Vancouver is, he decides to go cross-lot, as it were, and comes out of Bella Coola, which is farther up the northwest coast. And he barely misses Vancouver in the summer of 1793. In fact, Mackenzie runs into some native people up here who tell him that a guy named Makuba, somebody like you named Makuba, was in of course, they're a garbling of Vancouver. But Mackenzie actually records that. Of course, it's after his voyage is over, he realizes when he gets back to Montreal that he barely missed a fellow explorer, George Vancouver, who was exploring from the coast in, as opposed to Mackenzie, who was moving west in 1793. But again, Mackenzie's account is not published until 1801. Because we all know somewhat famously that Meriwether Lewis developed writer's block, in fact, he never wrote his journal. Mackenzie had the same kind of problem. It took him much of a decade to finally write up his report, which was published in 1801. Okay, so the last slide, I brought some of my books with me. If anyone wishes to help, I already sold one copy of Captain Cook Rediscovered. I also have a couple of my Lewis and Clark books I'd be happy to talk to anyone about. These maps, and of course you can come up and look. I'm going to be here for a while. If anyone wants to come up and look at these maps in detail up close, I'll be glad to stay here and talk to you about that, or you can look at your own leisure. Thanks again for coming out tonight.